project, doing much of the empirical work. So we'll be talking together. I'll just give a short introduction and start talking about the project, and then Rafael will take over, and of course we'll have time for look forward to questions and comments, etc. Let's share my screen. So Rafael, I downloaded our common Teams presentation, and I'll just present it from my side, and then you can take over and present it from your side afterwards. Yeah, so Cityfreight is a project that we got funded last year. I think it was actually, we got the notice late 2019. It's funded by the Research Council, and it's a project that's kind of following up from an initiative that we took to get this large grant for an FME. As large centers on renewable energy, and which we did not get, but we followed up with this part of the project and made an application out of that, and got that funded together with the Norwegian School of Economics. So the point of departure for this project is that so in my group at the SET Center, we are particularly interested in cities and sort of how to make cities more sustainable, particularly in terms when it comes to transport emissions. And so we work on urban planning, mobility, decarbonization of the transport sector in general. And what we've noticed is that a lot of the discussion is on the movement of people, but at the same time we're seeing that there's an increase in the movement of goods, particularly now, and we didn't know that when we applied, of course, particularly with Corona. We're shopping a lot more online, which means a lot more logistics, a lot more moving around of goods. And this is something that is typically forgotten in the policy discussion and also in research. So there's very little research on the sort of logistics side of transport compared to the amount of research and policy discussions on the transport of people. Just imagine, in Bergen, just think about all the talk we've had about Bybanen and bompenger and all this kind of stuff, but very little talk about this big logistics terminal right down in the middle of our city. So this is something we wanted to address in this project, and sort of the main aim of the project, just to put it in very simple words, is how do we make freight logistics in cities more sustainable? And very concretely, the goal with the project, I'll come back to this, but it's a very sort of user partner oriented project. Is that we really want to not just sort of do basic research, but also turn this into some actionable insights and some practical findings that policymakers and planners and people also in the private sector can use. So a main objective with the project is to provide public authorities with a toolbox for realistically evaluating major decisions that would make a city more energy efficient in terms of freight. Right. Another aspect of this, which I think we're just getting into now with these user partner meetings, we just had one last month, is that this is a type of funding scheme through the Research Council that requires user partners to be on board. It actually requires co-funding from user partners. So that means that we have the municipality on board, the regional authorities, the Chamber of Commerce, and they are putting in resources, I mean, to a large extent of in-kind, hours that they commit to the project. But it also means that they expect something from it. They expect to be included, and they expect to be. They expect that the results that we come up with are relevant and interesting for them to make it worthwhile their time. So that's I mean, we don't always have that in research projects, but I think it's a very interesting challenge and something that's really important that we do. And at the SET Center, we have this notion of actionable knowledge that's important to us. So we really strive to, of course, do good basic research that ends up in the highest ranked journals in the field, but at the same time make this research available and make it useful, actionable for actors in society. We have 3 case studies. We focus primarily on Bergen, but we also have Stavanger and Trondheim on board. Very often we use these 3 cases because Oslo in Norway is like in a league of its own, both in terms of the governance structure. It's not sort of underneath a regional authority, it's its own regional authority. And also the financial situation of Oslo is quite different. So these are, the big 3 out of the 4 big cities in Norway, and it's very useful to use these as cases. So before I hand it over to Rafael to talk more about specifics, I want to share this because this is an Energy Lab meeting, and I find it useful to explain sort of how we're thinking about sustainable development in cities, because you have this big debate about electric vehicles. Is that going to solve the problem? I sent out a very critical tweet the other day about this Will Ferrell videos from General Motors, and a lot of people are very happy about that. That General Motors are supporting electric vehicles, and which is fine, good, but it's also a car company, and that wants to sell more cars. So I mean, this is the way that I typically think of sustainable urban development, is in the terms of this pyramid. So you may have at the top of the pyramid, like you may have some interventions and policies that are directed at what we call smart solutions, switching to using apps and making transport and mobility more efficient, and trying to change people's behavior through these kind of campaigns, etc. But that's kind of the tip of the iceberg of the kind of how we have to think about policy and how we have to think about good urban development. Further down, and maybe in the middle of this pyramid, you would have more infrastructure projects, like changing from fossil fuel cars to EVs, for example, could be thought of as an infrastructure change. Putting bike lanes into roads, etc. But what I want to say with this pyramid is that the main fundamental thing, it really is to do with how we build cities, like basic planning procedures and the basic structures that we put in place for how our cities are being built. So where do we place things, right? Which has an enormous effect on all the other possibilities that we have for things. So for that reason, I mean, in this project we focus on sort of location of these hubs and terminals for logistics solutions. We try to work primarily with public authorities, also with private, but primarily with public, because they're the ones who kind of put in place this basic planning, land use kind of decisions, which are incredibly important for everything else. So basically what I'm trying to say is you can't, like if you have made bad planning decisions, if you use land, if you make bad land use decisions, you cannot fix that with an app. Like an app is just sort of the tip of the iceberg of how you have to think about policy interventions. Great. I'm sort of easing over to you now, Rafael, and so we have this project with Norwegian School of Economics. We also have law on board from UIB, and our focus within the project is on governance, sort of the governance challenges. What kind of problems do public authorities have in making logistics sustainable, and how do they collaborate with private actors, etc. So how are these governance processes working? How can they work better in order to enable sustainable logistics? Great. Rafael, I'm stopping my share right now and hand it over to you.
Yes, I can start mine if I've got full view. Yeah, looking good?
Yep.
Great. So, right, so thank you, Håvard. And the difference is for our project is building on, well, existing research. I would say a lot of existing research on urban logistics has up until now focused on either business case solutions or technological fixes, voluntary cooperation, or some sort of consolidation of goods that's either been through city hubs, where every actor just loads on from larger to smaller vehicles, or some sort of common consolidation. But nonetheless, the responsibility seems to be usually placed on the private sector to contribute to the solutions for urban logistics. And so the role of the public sector is what we're trying to focus on in Cityfreight. And even here in Norway, there's already been projects on urban logistics, such as the ones that I've listed here. And well, I put enclosed and Norsol because those are projects that have already concluded. And then under Cityfreight, I put ULADS, which stands for Urban Logistics as an On-Demand Service. And that's something that the city of Bergen is working on now. But again, it's kind of a service-based project, whereas we are focusing more on the role of the public authorities in governance systems. Oh, there we go. So in order to look at these issues, we asked ourselves, amongst others, these questions. How are Norwegian cities currently planning for urban logistics? What are the main challenges that they face towards achieving sustainable logistics? And what frameworks do they apply in their efforts towards it? And are there other forms of governance that can contribute to better solutions? So to sum it up, what does the situation for urban logistics in Norway look like now? What works well, what doesn't work well, what could be better? Right. And what we've seen up until now in our preliminary data or investigation is that the urban logistics is most likely still being treated as a private matter or as something that well, private actors, whether that be freight operators or transport companies or the actual receivers of goods, something that they have to solve by themselves. If we look at the case of Bergen, we see that the city has a climate and energy plan or strategy, the green strategy as it's called, the document in the middle. And the only way that urban logistics is mentioned in this strategy is in terms of an aim for there to be more low or zero emission vehicles in the field of urban logistics. And meanwhile, at the same time as this strategy was laid forward by the city authorities, we had the Chamber of Commerce create the document on the left, which is a kind of pathways towards green transport of goods and services, as they called it, in the Bergen area. And unlike the green strategy, this document actually came up with not just technological solutions, but also institutional changes and regulatory changes that could contribute to more sustainable logistics. And the thing is that, well, if we're going to tackle or try to address a sector as complex as urban logistics, you can't just look at how the local authorities work with the issue or how they work with the private sector. You also have to consider how the public authorities locally work with regional and national authorities. And an example of how this might have created some tensions already is that not in the distant past, as Håvard has mentioned, the goods terminal in Bergen city center, well, the local authorities want it out of the city center, and local businesses had been working with with alternatives, and they'd been working with the local authorities to create solutions to this wish to have the goods terminal out of the city center. But the national authorities made the decision to leave it where it is for the next 10, 20 years and make that decision later. So that is something that requires cooperation both locally and across levels of governance. And if we focus specifically on the municipalities, we see that one of the biggest barriers to tackling the challenges faced by urban logistics is that there's no clear ownership of urban logistics in these municipalities. And that's because there's not one place where the municipalities actually address urban logistics. And if we look at the 3 case studies of our project, Bergen, Stavanger, and Trondheim, we see that in all 3 of the cities, we have at least 2 different divisions, which are to the right of this diagram. We have at least 2 divisions in each of the cities that look at urban logistics in one way or another, but none of them has the overall authority to make plans or strategies on the matter. We have a few differences between the cities though, and that's the fact that in Trondheim, these 2 divisions are underneath one service area, and whereas in Bergen and Stavanger, you have one division underneath its own department or service area. And this could change, well, this has already changed from the 1st of this month, and it seems that the city of Trondheim has now established a transport unit or a transport division, which might have a more concentrated responsibility for urban logistics in terms of its general mobility and transport plans and responsibilities. The other difference in terms of governance styles between the 3 cities is that the city of Bergen has what's called the parliamentary system of governance here in Norway, which only a handful of Norwegian cities have. And that means that it is the politicians who have the responsibility for proposing new plans or strategies, whereas in the cities of Stavanger and Trondheim, the city is led by a municipal executive board, and it's up to the administration to propose new plans or strategies. So this is something that we will see if these differences affect the way that the urban logistics is looked at in the cities. If we look out of the local level, we also see that regional authorities also lack an ownership of urban logistics. And well, this is in part because regional authorities have to look beyond urban areas. They have to look at flows of goods and people all over their own regions, the counties in Norway. But what we already do have here at least in what was Hordaland and is now Vestland County, is regional land and transport plans that do actually either indirectly mention or affect urban logistics. These plans do in the end affect urban logistics in one way or another. And so it'll be interesting to see how regional authorities could take a greater role in both coordinating how different municipalities in an urban area work with urban logistics, and will helping the main city municipalities with addressing these the issues faced by urban logistics. And this has already been the case in the other 2 regions which we're studying, both in the Trondheim region, which is in Trøndelag County, and the Stavanger region, which is in Rogaland County. We've seen that the county authorities have taken more interest in logistics and taken a bigger role in addressing the new challenges faced by this sector. In Trøndelag County, this has led to the creation of an own strategy for goods transport, which is the document to the right. Whereas in Rogaland, in the Stavanger area, we've seen the creation of several reports to document the flows of goods, as well as the challenges that increased flows of goods in urban areas create. And as part of these reports in the Stavanger area, we've seen that those who actually came up with or contributed to these reports relied on existing research that shows that a lot of times when cities try to contribute to consolidation of goods flows, they at some point will contribute with subsidies to maintain these projects up and running. However, once these subsidies disappear, it seems that most projects that were attempted in the past ended up being concluded. So without subsidies, it seems that a lot of projects have failed, and the authorities in Stavanger are instead attempting to create a city hub solution that's financed by the users themselves. And ideally, they would want some sort of consolidation center that is basically its own independent actor that works towards consolidating the goods of all the logistics operators in the city. But for now, the private actors have their own more independent role. So that's something to analyze in the future as well, how that progresses. And as I've already mentioned, the stakeholders in the field of urban logistics are not just, are many. And you see this diagram that I've taken from an existing article on the topic shows the kind of, so to say, pathway from the point of departure to the end user, to the consumer. If you look at it from this way, you see a kind of chain, and in the middle you have the authorities. And one thing that we look at from a governance perspective is that the authorities doesn't just mean, as I've mentioned, analyzing the role of the authorities does not just mean analyzing the role or their cooperation with private actors or within their own jurisdiction, within their own institution. It also means cooperation across levels of governance, and it also means cooperation between the administrative and political sides of the authorities. And something that we've seen in our early data collection is that private actors see that there's not a lot of political interest on the flows of goods. They see that there's too much of a focus on the transport of people. And that is of course something that is very important, because we do, at least here in Norway, have a strong focus on, actually not just Norway, across the world, that we have of course a big focus on getting more people to take public transport, to bike, to walk, to avoid the use of private cars. And here in Norway, what we have are great plans to try to influence these changes in behavior. But what we have seen is that then there's an assumption that flows of goods and services are going to get a better foundation for their operations, but there's no real focus on how that will happen. And it's just assumed that the plans made for changes in transport of people are going to be positive for flows of goods and services regardless. So both administrative and political authorities need to see that these two things go together, and that solutions that address the transport of goods and services will also be beneficial for the entire field of transport in cities. And I've mentioned that this is something that's already happening in Norway. Here in Norway, this is done through the byvekstavtaler, the urban growth agreements, which is cooperation between the state, regional authorities, and the municipalities. But these agreements focus exclusively on flows of people and on reducing the use of private vehicles. And so the main goal in this is that there should not be any growth in the use of private vehicles. And there's an explicit exemption to the flows of goods and services. But it seems that the actors in the logistics sector are worried that this means that the changes needed in urban areas for their operations to be better and for their sector to become more sustainable need to be taken into consideration into these generic plans for urban mobility and urban transport. And this is something that's already been looked at a European level. In the past 10 years, there's been an increased focus on urban mobility and how urban mobility needs to also take into account urban logistics. And one suggestion for this has been to adapt mobility plans to include chapters on urban logistics, or to create annexes to urban mobility plans that focus on urban logistics. Here in Norway, I've already mentioned the NORSOLT project, which stands for Norwegian Sustainable Urban Logistics Plans. And this project concluded with a guideline for Norwegian municipalities to come up with these types of urban logistics plans. But it's not just about creating these plans. We need to see how municipalities are able to take it into their internal operations and their cooperation with both the private sector and other parts of the public sector.
Rafael, could you please wrap up in order to save some time for questions and comments from the audience, please?
I've got 1 minute. So the last thing that I was going to say is that here in Trondheim, we've already seen how the regional authorities are taking urban logistics into the urban growth agreement in the region, and they've done this by including a goal that the transport of goods should be greener and more effective, and they've got some funds into this. So it'll be interesting to see if urban logistics also becomes parts of general transport and mobility plans here in Norway and other parts of the world, because cooperation between local and regional authorities seems to be the key for urban mobility plans and urban logistics plans generally. And I was just going to say that the one way that this might work, one way to tackle this from the state level might be the climate white paper, which has included more goals and more focus on land use and planning, as Håvard has mentioned. That I can stop there.